A very good morning, children. Continuing with the chapter, after we finished with the non-tax receipts, okay, the next what we are going to do is capital receipts, okay. Remember, the budget receipts are revenue receipts and capital receipts. What we did till now was revenue receipts. Now coming to capital receipts. Now capital receipts are the receipts which create a liability and they also have reduction in assets, okay. These receipts create a liability for the government, and also these receipts cause reduction in assets of the government. Now, how do they create a liability? For example, loans by the government are a liability. These are to be paid back, okay. So if at all the center is giving any loan to the government or to the state government, then definitely it creates a liability for the state government to return it back, okay. Then the receipts cause reduction in assets of the government. For example, if the government is trying to sell any part of its shares to the public, then definitely that is causing reduction in the assets. For example, if at all the government is planning to sell the shares of Air India, then definitely there is a reduction in the assets of the government, okay. So capital receipts, they create a liability and also they cause reduction in the assets of the government. Fine. Now, the capital receipts have been divided into three parts: recovery of loans, borrowing and other liabilities, and other receipts. Now, recovery of loans, as I told you, the central government offers loans to the state government to cope with financial crisis. When these loans are recovered, assets of the government are reduced, okay. So, definitely when the center is giving any loan to the state and when these loans are recovered, naturally the assets of the the state is reduced, okay. Then borrowing and other liabilities. Now, while lending creates assets, borrowing creates liability naturally. So whenever the government borrows money from the general public or from any bank or from any part of the world, then definitely it actually creating a liability, okay. So from where all the government can borrow money, they can borrow money from general public, okay, and they can borrow money from Reserve Bank of India and the rest of the world, okay. Then coming to other receipts, okay. Now this is nothing but your disinvestment, and disinvestment is an action where the government sells a part of its shares to the private enterprises. So naturally what is happening here, there is a reduction in the assets, okay. So disinvestment occurs when the government sells off its shares of public sector enterprises to private sector. So in all these activities, children, what do you see? That there is reduction in assets and also there is a creation of liability. So capital receipts, always remember, they create a liability and also cause a reduction in assets. Fine. Then coming to the next part, okay. Now you have budget expenditure. Now budget receipts was divided into two: capital receipts and revenue receipts. But budget expenditure is divided again into two: revenue receipts and revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, okay. Now what is revenue expenditure? Does not create any asset, no reduction in liability, which means even when you're spending the money, it is not going to create any asset for you, nor it's going to reduce your liability, okay. So it does not create any asset for the government and it does not cause any reduction in the liability of the government, okay. Does not create any asset. How? For example, expenditure by the government on old age pensions, salaries and scholarships are to be treated as revenue expenditure because this does not lead to any type of asset formation. It is an expenditure for the government, but is it creating any asset? No. So it's not creating any asset for the government. Then it does not cause any reduction in the liability. Expenditure by way of grants to the state government to cope with natural calamities like floods and earthquakes does not reduce the financial liability of the central government in any manner. Accordingly, this is to be treated as revenue expenditure, okay. So here when the center is spending money or giving money to the state government to cope up with any natural calamity, then this is not causing any reduction in the liability of the state government, okay. So revenue expenditure, though the government is spending money, it's not going to create any asset for the government, nor it's going to reduce the liability of the government, okay. Now, there are some examples given of revenue expenditure. Wage bill of the government, okay, whatever the wages the government is going to pay. The interest payments, if at all you're taking any loans and you're paying interest. Expenditure on subsidies, okay, the subsidies, the different types of subsidies the government is going to give, that is an expenditure, okay. Defense purchases. So in all these cases, children, what do you see? It is not creating any asset, nor it is reducing any liability of the government, okay. So that is your revenue expenditure. Now coming to capital expenditure, it creates assets for the government, and also it causes reduction in the liability of the government. How does it create assets? Equity or shares of the domestic or multinational corporation purchased by the government may be cited as an example. If at all the government is buying the shares of any domestic or an MNC, then it's definitely increasing its assets, right? So that is your capital expenditure, which increases the assets of the government. It causes reduction in liabilities of the government. Repayment of loans certainly reduces the liability of the government, okay. If at all the government has taken any loan and it is paying back, then definitely the liability of the government is reduced, okay. So if at all the government is buying any shares of any company or any multinational company, it's creating an asset for the for itself, and then it causes reduction in liabilities. If at all the government is paying any loan, then definitely it's reducing its liabilities, okay. So capital expenditure creates assets and also reduces the liabilities. Again, the examples are given here. Expenditure on land and buildings, okay. Then expenditure on machinery and equipment, okay, creating asset. Purchase of shares, again it's creating an asset. Loans by the central government to the state government or state corporations, okay. So what is happening here? They are reducing their liability, okay. Now coming to the plan and non-plan expenditure, okay. Now the budget, all the expenditure which has been done by the government, they have been divided in two parts, the plan and non-plan expenditure. Now what is a plan expenditure? It refers to the expenditure which relates to specified plans and programs of development, okay. When the budget is prepared, naturally, we see that, they have many schemes and plans for the coming financial year. So that is a plan expenditure. Assistance of the central government to the state government, okay, which is always there. It includes both revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, okay. So anything, which the government plans for the coming financial year, the different plans or the programs for development or any schemes, that is a planned expenditure, definitely, because everything is being mentioned very clearly in the budget. So it is called as planned expenditure. And any assistance which the central government is trying to give to the state government, okay, that is also plan expenditure. Now when we talk about plan expenditure, children, it talks about both the revenue as well as capital expenditure, okay. Now coming to non-plan expenditure, okay, specifically, the routine functioning of the government. All expenditure other than plan expenditure is classified as non-plan expenditure. Specifically, non-plan expenditure relates to expenditure on routine functioning of the government, or it includes expenditure on such services as law and order, defense, and subsidies. So this is something, children, which always happens in routine. Whether you're supposed to maintain the law and order in the country, the defense has always is supposed to be, strong and alert, and then subsidies, okay, the subsidies given to probably the backward regions, or in any kind of subsidies which has been given to the people, okay, all that is non-plan expenditure. Fine. So the budget is budget expenditure, plan and non-plan expenditure. Now there is one note which is very, very important, children. Now we know that the planning commission has been abolished, okay. We have studied that when we were doing IED, okay. Now instead of planning commission, now you have Niti Aayog, okay. I hope everybody remembers that. Now after the abolition of planning commission, the government is also considering to abolish the classification of budgetary expenditure as plan and non-plan expenditure. Please mind it, the government is considering, it has not yet done it. It is only considering to take out the budgetary expenditure as plan and non-plan and just make it into one expenditure. Fine. So this is it for this class, children. Please go through all the terms very clearly, especially capital, revenue expenditure, capital receipts, revenue receipts. You're going to get confused, what creates assets, what creates liabilities. So please make notes properly as we always do. And if at all you have any doubts, you can always contact me. This is it for this class. Thank you.